Going to get started. As we get started, this is great. I'm so happy. As we get started, you can introduce yourselves in the chat. I'm going to share a timeline and a brief video clip, and then I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll start with the panelists, and Tracy will moderate. But just as a quick warm up, I'm going to share a couple of items, a timeline and a brief video clip that we worked on last year. So happy that you are here. Yeah, if you could just introduce yourselves in the chat, and then when we have Q&A afterwards, everyone will have a little bit more chance to kind of ask some questions and get to know different interests. And first, I wanted to say what wonderful people we have here. We have three awesome panelists. We also have a lot of people here as audience who could also someday be panelists or video interview subjects because we have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. Just the collective wisdom in this group is amazing. So we have three people who have some really awesome, great stories to share. To start out, we just wanted to frame it by sharing a timeline and a couple of quick things from there. This timeline is from our website, and is something that what I love about history, and one reason Tracy and I enjoy working together so much is because we both love being kind of grounded in history, that whatever we're doing right this moment is also grounded in history, as even this conversation shows. On our website, we have a timeline and something that can always be updated. For preparing for tonight, I took out the middle section of the timeline just because that's the section we're kind of focusing on tonight, and we'll probably redo that middle section of the timeline later. But the timeline starts with, and many of you are familiar with the story, and there's some great books written on this. There's just a lot. But the story really begins as far back as 1948, when there was a regional plan, basically a national plan, that after World War II, the federal government wanted to build highways all over the country. There was a regional plan that envisioned the highway going through Boston, and the federal government was going to provide the money to the states to build highways. The state developed the area specific plan. And then as people saw highway building progressing through the country, and seeing the damage that it did to cities around the country, and we're not telling this story tonight, we're telling the later story, but the kind of story that people are still celebrating today is the People Before Highways movement that arose to say, this is not what we want. We don't want a highway cutting through the city. And it was, really, really a great story of people speaking up, protesting, and kind of one of my favorite culminating moments in reading this history is the governor, who was really considered himself a highwayman, an expert in highway building, who said the three words, "We were wrong," which is probably one of the great moments in political history. So in our timeline, we have from the 1948 plan to the 1970 kind of turning point where the governor said we were wrong. And it's not like instantly they said, well, why don't we build a park? And then the next day there was a park. In stories of civic engagement, it's never quite that simple. So we're going to have 20 years, which is kind of going to be a little bit of our focus tonight, of what happened from 1970 when Governor Sargent said we were wrong, we're not going to do the highway, or let's hold off on the highway plans. He didn't say let's cancel, he said let's hold off. And then, gradually it's like, yeah, we're not doing the highway. What are we doing? And there was a lot of visioning. It wasn't immediate that they just said it will be a park, but there's a lot more that happened over a period of 20 years, groundbreaking, maybe about 10 years later, and then construction and continued visioning until we have, depending on who you ask, when did the park open? The Orange Line opened in 1987. The MDC grand opening of the park was in 1990. Notice that our park timeline doesn't end in 1990 when the park opens, but we continue with Nasreen, I'm glad you're here. We have in that middle period between the MBTA opening, we have when Roxbury Community College, which was a major part of the vision for what to do with this land. We have the Reggie Lewis Track and Athletic Center opens. And there's a lot of other peripheral projects that aren't necessarily part of the parkland, not peripheral, but in the land that was cleared for the highway, there are a lot of different projects that happened, whether it was housing, office space, the community college. There was a lot that happened that was spun off from the highway building project. And so there's a lot of that that's part of the story. I mean, there's so many layers of this story. And then the timeline that we share on our website really focuses on park related things. So we have when the Conservancy was organized, which was 2004. Carlton Court Dog Park was 2005. The Butterfly Meadow, I just chose that as sort of a landmark garden. Now, there were a lot of gardens that could be an example of some of the South End gardens we use today. Festival Garden in JP is kind of a landmark time in 2011. Lorber Family Playground at Jackson Square and the Children's Garden in 2016. Mini grant program, a few of you on this call are mini grant recipients, so worth mentioning. And then the most recent dates, I just put the pandemic in 2020, but the reason, and then I ran out of space. Ran out of space on the page, and I mentioned that because it's significant, because I'm like, okay, I'm going to say the Burnett Street Park and Community Garden. I'm going to say the skate park. I need more space on this page. Excuse me. I'm going to go to the next slide. This next slide, I wanted to share some photos and never do anything without some beautiful park photos. But meanwhile, I'm working on this timeline and working over this past year on the video in this series, the curriculum series, you're going to see a quick excerpt from. It's so amazing to dig into old photos and newspaper articles. Lucy Jefferson was a wonderful park volunteer and recently passed away. She's a relative of Jenny, friend of mine, friend of many of us, and passed away this last month. Because of that, meanwhile, just kind of digging back into some photos, Lucy shared a ton of photos. She was a park steward. She took photos. She was on PMAC, did a lot of the Conservancy projects. So really just wonderful. And so I wanted to just take this second while we're talking about park history, and then I'm going to tie it back to what we're talking about, to share a couple of her photos. She and her husband, Carter, lived in the South End, and then later on Huntington Ave in the St. Botolph neighborhood. And as I say, they were park stewards of a garden, and then active on PMAC, doing a lot of committee work as well as some photography and helping with some of our social media. I didn't know, I forgot that this beautiful classic photo, the one in the top right, and I'm going to go to the next slide, this was one of Lucy's photos that she shared with us, and this has become one of our go-to photos because, of course, this is the classic view of the Southwest Corridor from Mass Ave, and I often refer to this as the classic view because it's, breathtaking view.
And I live right here. That's exactly where I live.
Exactly where you live. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, you'll take a walk over and you'll,
walk.
It's breathtaking. Exactly. She took this photo, and until today, I had forgotten that this was her photo. And it actually made me happy to think of sort of our collective set of knowledge and resources that when you tell the story of the Southwest Corridor Park, whether it's the current story or the story going back to people before highways, how many different people were really involved and contributed. And it's so easy to say, oh, who did that? Who took that photo? Who did that graffiti on the wall? And to try to put it all together, people will say, we did this. So that's a little bit of a tribute to Lucy, and just one of the really wonderful people that we work with. Last summer, in lieu of doing our usual mini grants because of the pandemic, we did a project instead, which was a Circle of Parks curriculum. We did 3 videos. There are 3 videos. There's a set of primary sources. This is designed for classroom use, for classroom or youth program use. And so it's basically a circle of parks. So it's looking at the Southwest Corridor Park, along with also looking at the Emerald Necklace. And I'm going to just give you a very short clip from this. What we're most excited about is moving on to our panel. And so I'm just going to give you kind of a brief bio of our 3 panelists and then give it to Tracy to continue. Our 3 panelists, we're going to start with Weezy Wallstein, a community activist and organizer, coordinator of Jobs Equity Initiative at Action for Regional Equity. Weezy has lived in Jamaica Plain since the 1970s and was a member of one of the station area task force groups that provided community input into the design of the Southwest Corridor. Second panelist is Ernest Costin, a Roxbury resident for over 50 years. Ernest, or also known as Randy Costin's work has spanned environmental work, youth work, and community activism. During the 1970s and 80s, he was involved with early community gardening initiatives along the corridor, later returning to the corridor as a DCR landscaper. His knowledge of environment and agriculture has roots in his experiences growing up on his grandparents' farm in North Carolina. And third panelist is Betsy Johnson, community activist, urban agriculturalist, former interim director of the American Community Gardening Association, and longtime board member of ACGA. Betsy was a longtime resident of the South End, now in Springfield, and was instrumental in creating community gardens in Boston, including the launch of the Lower Roxbury Land Trust and many other community-led initiatives. And with that, I'd like to hand it to Tracy. Tracy is co-chair of PMAC and lead of Community Gardens. Hand it to Tracy to start the panel.
Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everyone, and I'm so thrilled that everyone's here to hear about the history of our park that connects us along a almost 5-mile stretch of Boston. And I'm thrilled to be bringing together this interesting group of speakers tonight. Very often when I'm talking about the park with people newer to Boston, they ask questions about the history. And I think there's a real curiosity and interest in how this special linear park came to be and how it was developed in partnership between community members and government agencies, among many others. Each of our speakers has a unique vantage point on that history, and it is a privilege to hear from them. We're going to hear from each of our speakers in 2 rounds of reflections, and then we will open up for Q&A. Please hold your questions and comments until the end, or feel free to share them in the chat while people are speaking, and we will try to get to all of them as time allows at the end. We are going to ask each speaker to reflect on the following questions in their initial remarks, which will last approximately 10 minutes per speaker. I will give each speaker a 1-minute alert as we approach the 10-minute mark. So we're going to start with Wheezy. Wheezy, when did you first get connected with the project that became the Southwest Corridor Park? What were some of your most memorable experiences, and what would you like people to know about?
So first of all, thank you very much for giving me a chance to say hi to Betsy for the first time in probably 40 years. So wonderful to see you. And also to think about what it was like 45 years ago. So I'm struggling to separate out what was me being very young and what was going on. And I feel like many of you were actually part of this as well. And I'm not sure, I was going to say, so you should also just speak out and add your memories to this. Tracy might not like that a whole lot, but people should. This is sort of like my little set of memories. And other people have their memories too, and should put them into the mix. I don't have an analysis. I can only say what I was living through. In 76, I was living on Montebello. I bought this house, but I hadn't moved in yet. Montebello was I don't know if everybody knows it, it's 1 block, a long block going uphill from Washington Street to Franklin Park. And it's directly due east of where I landed when I bought this house. It was when this house could still be taken. They weren't sure what houses were going to be taken yet, when the last of the takings for the corridor were being done. And it was a time when there was a lot of arson. When we lived on Montebello, that was the year of the big snowstorm, the 77 snowstorm, and we were locked in for days, and we finally had to shovel out ourselves because somebody in the middle of the block needed to get to the hospital. And the street was a third Black, a third white, and a third Spanish speaking. And nobody had ever talked to anybody. And it was like, people were like hyper aware that they had never talked to each other. There was a, so we shoveled, and we shoveled together. And this was the first time people actually had a conversation with anybody on the street. and that whole sort of sense of this is, there's a conversation about connecting with each other that has to happen was also a part of what was going on in the corridor. And so I moved into my house in 77. I would wake up with flames, you know, in my windows repeatedly, because there was that much arson right around here. The corridor was a wall. It was about 5 houses had been taken between my house and the railroad embankment. And it was like living in the wilderness. We would walk through and we would dig out the remnants of the gardens of the houses that had been torn down. So all of us fed our gardens with perennials and trees and shrubbery from the gardens of houses that had been torn down. It was busing was new and really bad. The street that I was on, the family I bought from was white with 5 kids. The family next door was black with 5 kids. The men had been scoutmasters together. The kids were all friends. The family whose house I bought felt like they had to leave because their youngest kid had been put in a school in East Boston, and he lost a whole year of school. The bus actually never came. And so they moved out of town. I mean, this was all very present, this whole discussion of what the connections, the lack of connections, who had connections. It was all very, there was an intentionalness in JP of having these connections. The corridor meetings, you know, I can only remember it from my really small window into it. When they started doing the planning, I was between 2 station areas. And so I was on 2 different station area task forces. And I remember it as an amazing opportunity to have, you know, have choices of saying, you know, did we want tot lots? Did we want basketball courts? Did we want whatever else the choices were? That these were, it was a heavily staffed planning initiative with different station area task force groups. I'm thinking that some of you were also part of it and had very different experiences, which is making me very nervous. But it's like, it's what I remember as a young person. And that idea of agency, of having an ability to say, you know, what we would want, when in fact it was, you know, it was this massive wall. It was that stop I-95 painted, is right by where I live, and blocking us from the other side of the neighborhood. This whole, this process, this intentionality was so present. When I was thinking of buying this house, I knocked on the neighbors' doors just to introduce myself, get a sense of who they were. And the man across the street, who I thought of as older even then, he introduced himself as he introduced himself as an Italian couple. He said he had worked on the trains, and he said, "My name is Tony. I stopped the highway." That was how he introduced himself to a new person knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, you know, I'm thinking of that house across the street." I remember it as a long process. And then one day the wall came down, you know, over many days. And then one day it was like the tap turned and the trains started running. And it felt just kind of like that. It was like dry, and then there were trains. And I was working, actually, I was working at the shipyard in Quincy at the time, and I was commuting with people from Roxbury. And I realized that we had been years, literally, in this planning process leading to this day that the tap was turned and the trains flowed, and their trains stopped and nobody had told them about it. And so it was like this really like mind-blowing kind of juxtaposition of what was going on. So that's where I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Wheezy. There's so much I'm sure we're all wondering about, so including me. So we'll hold our curiosity for after everyone speaks. But Ernest, welcome, it's your turn. So I'd love to ask you to reflect on when you first got connected with the Southwest Corridor Park, or what became the park, and what are some of your most memorable experiences?
Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces. Some I don't recognize anymore, and names I recognize, Betsy Johnson and Wheezy from back in the day. And every time I think about Betsy Johnson, I want to ask her about John Blackwell, but that'll come up at another time. So living in Roxbury here in Highland Park, the Southwest Corridor was just one of a bunch of things that, you know, a lot of people in the Black communities was dealing with. One of the things was the space around Roxbury, you know, Community College, you know, what was going to happen with that. That was sort of looking for space. There was also a lot of issues around a lot of the homes that were owned by Black people that was taken by eminent domain. People, you know, were not interested in moving, but, you know, the land, the houses was taken. Communities were being destroyed for the most part. And so there was a lot of upheaval. The whole piece with the mayoral race, Louise Day Hicks, you know, school desegregation, busing. So there was a lot of racial tension. There was a lot of advocating for jobs that was taking place along the corridor. Before it was, you know, come to a halt. It seemed like there was a conspiracy with city planners to sort of put a highway between Annunciation Road and Whittier Street, you know, sort of just split the Black community into two sections so that people were not able to, you know, to move towards each other. So there was a lot of bad feelings. And there was, without a doubt, racial tension across the board. Education, jobs, housing. It was just disproportionate the way that things were laid out. So I remember demonstrations that were led by, you know, Chuck Turner, Mal King. You know, we thought that we needed to have a say in what was happening in our neighborhood on both sides of the tracks. And one of the things that was really interesting is that the corridor sort of started a level of integration between Roxbury and Jamaica Plain. JP had been primarily working class whites with some Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and a few Dominicans. Black people, for the most part, did not spend time on Center Street, Jamaica Plain, except in and around Jackson. Then there was always issues between Bromley and Academy. So there was always, you know, some tension. And so the corridor sort of lowered the tension. It became like a no man's land. It wasn't something that a lot of people could really identify as part of their neighborhood. It was like an area that everybody could participate. It was an area that different communities could ask for what they wanted to see happen in the meetings. People were asking for gardens, so we wound up with a lot of gardens. People were asking for tennis courts, and we got tennis courts. We got playgrounds because there was playgrounds needed. And it's still going on to this very day. You know, we're talking about dog parks. No one had ever mentioned a dog park. Well, there had been a mention of a dog park. And so the South End, you know, there was a dog park. The playgrounds and the skateboards, that was all relatively new. People were riding bikes. Now we have motorized bikes, not battery powered bikes, and we battery powered skateboards. So it's almost become dangerous for people walking the pedestrian path because the speed of vehicles and people moving along the pedestrian paths. Now, one of the other issues I remember was that John Schumacher had gotten the contract for the construction of 2 or 3 of the sections. And then they were going to be given over, and it was a question, you know, who would get those jobs? The MDC at the time, the Metropolitan District Commission, was going through changes, and that had always been, you know, who you know, and a lot of the people were going to be asked to do things they weren't qualified to do, but they knew people and they had connections. And then at the same time, you know, DCR, you know, Department of Recreation and Conservation, Conservation and Recreation was sort of, you know, coming about in itself, and people were sort of vying for the politics of
everybody be quiet, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet, be quiet. Everybody be quiet. Everybody be quiet.
Could people please mute their microphones? Thank you.
So one of the dog attack. So one of the things was happening is that how those jobs were gonna, you know, come about, who was gonna get the jobs. And we had, you know, people like Herb Jackson. I don't know how many people remember Herb Jackson, but he was pushing hard, you know, for a percentage of jobs from the corridor, you know, to go to people that lived along the corridor and in the community. And that's basically how I got my start as a landscape contractor. I actually, you know, got into bidding, and I wound up bidding a job and winning a section of landscape maintenance and construction along the corridor. And then later on, years later, I came back to work along the corridor, you know, for DCR, you know, Department of Conservation and Recreation. So the corridor has a very, very rich history because each section of the corridor, like the South End has changed, Lower Roxbury has changed. The section by Annunciation Road that was nicknamed Assassination Road, that has all changed. Northeastern has gotten more involved. They could be more involved. Wentworth could be more involved. I'm not sure how involved they are. But the corridor north, English High School wasn't always located where it is, but that's a new location, you know, and they wound up with that nice athletic field that was, you know, part of what, you know, people wanted. And I guess Doyle's was Doyle's was another spot that was a lot of meetings took place at Doyle's, and they're gone. But English High School is there, and they have a nice field, nice space behind the school. There's a nice space on the side of the school, and I think they almost have 2 parking lots at least. So yeah, so the corridor has changed a lot, and it's changed the neighborhoods. At first, it was more of a threat to neighborhood solidarity. It was a threat to connectivity in the neighborhood, and now it's through community activists. People have sort of used the corridor as a means of communication between neighborhoods. So yeah, I'm open to questions, but a lot of it just sort of happened because people were involved and wanted to see something more than what city planners had on their table.
Thank you so much, Ernest. And Betsy,
pleasure.
I'd like to turn to, we'll be circling back, so we'll have a second round in a moment. But first, I want to hear from Betsy. And Betsy, when did you first get connected with what became the park, the Southwest Corridor Park? And what would you like to share with us?
Well, I'll share that I moved to the South End in 1974, shortly out of college. It was where poor students could buy a whole house and be the subsidized residents of the house with tenants. But I almost lived next door to Anne Hirschfang, who really is another of the people who could and should be doing these reminiscence. And my first involvement, we were living on West Rutland Square, which dead ends to, at that point, the railroad tracks in that section between Columbus Avenue and the railroad tracks. And I remember, I think it was even still it would have been in like early 1975. There was I still to this day remember a meeting in Anne Hirschfang's living room with Fred Salucci, who was there to tell us about his great plans of how they were going to relocate the Orange Line from going down Washington Street and removing that blighting influence to that part of the neighborhood and put it at the end of our street. And so needless to say, everybody said, well, you're just going to be moving the blight from one part of the neighborhood to the other part of the neighborhood. So then they presented us with three alternatives. One was the subway trains and the Amtrak trains would be at ground level. One that they would be below grade, and a third alternative, which they presented so that we would be convinced that we should go along with the middle alternative, is that it would get covered. And even the initial proposal was not, it was just that it would be covered, somewhat like the Red Line is down in part of Dorchester, where you literally just have a sort of plain cement cover over the Red Line. And people, so, well, first of all, we're not going to accept the at grade. And we really, because of the density of the South End, you absolutely have to cover it. But then I'm forgetting who it was. I think it might've been Ken Kruckermeyer and others came up with initial, were savvy enough to know how to do the cost estimates for what it would take to actually have it be a park. And so during that next sort of it was an intense lobbying effort of folks from the entire corridor. It's one of the first things that brought people together. And there were a number of folks from the Bromley Heath area, as well as Jamaica Plain, who got together and said, and Mel King was really just super instrumental in all of this, and saying, no, if you're going to do this project, you're going to do it right. And doing it right means you're going to put these new tracks below grade and covered with a park. Now, there wasn't 100%, as people know, there are open sections of the corridor, particularly through parts of Roxbury and then further through parts of Jamaica Plain. So it wasn't a total success, in terms of, and I think maybe the south end, I mean, houses were closer to the railroad tracks in those sections, and we did have Mel King. So I'm going to give him a lot of credit for why there's more of the corridor was covered through that section. But one of the early arguments, once sort of there were the community design project processes that Randy and Weezy mentioned, was where would people be able to cross? Where would there be crossings across this new park in the south end section? Because to our face, there were folks from the St. Botolph area who at these meetings told us, South End folks, we don't want your crime. So no, we are going to limit the number of places to where there were existing crossings over the railroad tracks. Those are the only places there'll be crossings across the Southwest Corridor. And to this day, the folks at Cumberland and I'm forgetting the names of the street in St. Botolph, you can see the folks jumping the fence who, how many years later regretted that there were not a few more open-minded people from the St. Botolph section who were involved with the planning of the park. Ralph there, who lives on Wellington Street, probably would like that he could go right through to over to, I'm forgetting, it's a Blackwood at that point. Anyway, the next street over, but that was not to be. Then the train stopped in 1979. That was, we sort of had a big celebration. But that's when the rats began. That was, from the neighborhood perspective, that was one of the big failings is and it's one of the lessons they learned for the big dig, is that they needed to have done a lot better planning and prevention for the rats. And the next decade in the South End was quite interesting in terms of the rat infestations as they dug out the corridor. And but then do remember the grand open, we showed on your timeline the opening of the trains, but actually already parts of the park were already quite established. And I know that one of the big controversies was, because there's the sort of highest concentration of the community gardens that were placed all along the corridor in the South End section. And the gardens were there. We didn't have water yet, but people wanted to get gardening. And so there was a little bit of the same way there was sort of guerrilla gardening. I mean, there was quite the tradition for setting up guerrilla community gardens throughout the entire city during the 1970s and into the 80s. And so I do remember a number of people, starting to garden already, even before it was resolved who would take over the park, how the gardens would be managed, and all of those issues. One of the things that was done in terms of the community, there were, again, just an offside connection. I had one of the chief community outreach liaison staff who worked for Faye Spofford, who was the contractor, happened to be the mother of one of my best childhood friends. So it was sort of like, I go to one of these meetings and there's Mary Snyder. What are you doing? And, sort of out of the blue. And in fact, there's a memorial bench and tree recognizing Mary's role in helping and make sure that the community voices were heard during the design process. That park is, I think it's at the end of Carlton Street in the south. It's between West Newton Street and Back Bay Station. There's a little side park with a memorial to Mary. But yeah, I mean, it was one of these things that was meeting after meeting. And a couple, do also remember though, a big issue came up, you know, as any projects under construction, there's cost overruns, and they started to come back to us. Well, one of the big issues was the open section of the corridor through Roxbury to Jamaica Plain has the concrete sidewalls are not smooth concrete. They're sort of articulated so that they're less susceptible to graffiti and stuff. And I still to this day remember Mel King, you know, coming to this meeting, you know, along with hundreds of us coming to this meeting from, again, the others have mentioned how the planning process really did bring people from the South End came to this meeting to help defend and to support the folks from Roxbury and Jamaica Plain that no, they couldn't get away with smoothing out those walls. They had to, you know, or there was another meeting where they were going to make where the dancing is going to be taking place. They were going to make that smaller. And again, you know, there were these, numbers, up to 100 activists from from the entire corridor who came together to make sure you made a commitment that the corridor was going to be built this way. You're going to follow through and make sure the corridor is built this way. And I think those are some of my earliest memories during the construction project.
Thank you, Betsy.
I think I'll get.
Say you have a few.
I will talk to a little bit further
wrap up
along.
this round if you'd like.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Already we've had such incredible. I mean, each of you individually has brought so much nuance and detailed information to our understanding of this history, but collectively, sort of triangulating what each of you are saying, it's very powerful. So I can't thank you enough. This is incredible. So I want to follow up with one more question for each of you, and I'm going to start with Lizzie again. What have you learned from your involvement with the development of the Southwest Corridor Park that has shaped your work and life going forward? I know that sounds very lofty, so take it for however you want to, however casually or seriously. It could be something small, it could be something very profound. And also share with us a little bit about other issues or community advocacy that you've been involved with since.
So I had the good fortune over the last 10 years to work pretty closely with Chuck Turner. So that the whole, to hear you talk about the jobs demands and how that fight it wasn't just an open space fight. It was for every aspect of how this could impact people's lives. And so it was really, it's been, and in more recent years, working with folks in the Eggleston area, in particular, JP, we've been monitoring the construction along the corridor to do the enforcement of the Boston residents' jobs policy in the JP, coming out of Plan JP Rocks. And so I guess it's really to, with that kind of leadership and opportunity to be in spaces where a lot of that needing to keep going with the fight forever. I mean, look how much has changed, but it doesn't change. It doesn't change for everybody in a good way unless people really stay on it. So I guess I would say that, and that that sort of to have had the opportunity to work so closely with Chuck for so long, knowing his involvement with the corridor in particular has left me with a lot of lessons.
Thank you, Easy. So Ernest, turning to you, what have you taken away from your involvement with the corridor? And, I learned from what you shared that, you've had several points of involvement, both sort of more formally as an employee, but also as a contractor, but also as a community member and activist. What do you take with you into the rest of your life?
Well, it's very interesting. I feel really fortunate and really honored in a lot of ways to have been a part of something that I had no idea how it was going to come out. I really, I had lost more battles than won for the most part. There were a lot of battles with the school, with the Boston School Committee. There were a lot of struggles around housing. There was a lot of struggles with the city of Boston. There was struggles with the police department. There was struggles with why the neighborhood was burning down. And, it was just, it seemed like there was just a lot of struggles that was never going to see anything positive. When you have firemen, that are setting fires to buildings, you have police officers that are involved with selling drugs to kids. You have teachers in the school system being protected by the unions, and the kids are not learning. It was just a lot of chaos. And now, through all of that, we didn't get all the jobs, but we got some. There are people hired. I see people working along the corridor now that, and I smile. I smile when I see, the little carts with all the kids, in a little tow chain, carrying stuff, and that's really, it's really, really great. And I feel really good when I see families, over on School Street, the park over there, the basketball, fathers and sons and kids, people that probably weren't even born when it was oil trucks and coal and, a lot of pollution. And now it's a really, really nice place. And it's really great seeing the playgrounds. It's really great in those areas where it's open. The kids are looking at the trains. Kids love to look at trains go by and they can sort of, see the trains. And to remember what it was like before they started taking the houses down and what it was like when they took the houses down. I remember St. Paul Street, along the tracks, all those dead end streets, they were not really good spots. They were not, like when you live next to the railroad tracks, it's not, your house always shake, so people were partying along the, what is now called the corridor, but it was not a nice place. And so now I see dog parks and I see gardens, and there's a lovely picture that we started with of the John Hancock Tower. Well, not the tower so much, but the John Hancock building at that time was the tallest building in the city. And now it's dwarfed by a lot of skyscrapers. The whole skyline of the city has changed. So yeah, it's, and it's a lot of communication now with people from the South End, through Jamaica Plain, through Roxbury. It's become a source of communication. People get to see the same people in the morning riding their bikes, their skateboards, they're walking. So, it's good to see kids from Northeastern jogging along the corridor, that would have never been before. It's good. And people go to work every day rather than ride the T by bicycle, from Forest Hill Station all the way to Copley Square. So yeah, so I feel really good about it.
Thank you so much. And Betsy, what have you taken away from your involvement with the corridor? What would you like to share with
Well,
us?
I sort of around the same time period, that is when I got involved with community gardens. And eventually, you mentioned that I was executive director of the national organization, but that was on the heels of being involved with first of all, the organization that provided overall support services, actually creating an organization that provided overall support services to the community gardens in Boston, regardless of whether they were on the corridor and owned and managed by initially the MDC, or they were the Fenway Victory Gardens, or they were individual land trusts like the garden that Ernest is involved with, or the land trust that we started in the South End. So I did spend a lot of time, being involved in helping to see if we could get how the corridor community gardens were managed, and I guess now there's looking at a whole new, they're starting to be need to be rebuilt, and how we can get the funding. One of the other projects though that I was very involved with is I was the Claremont Neighborhood Association representative to what was called PMAC. And that was the 20-year plus effort of representatives from all of the neighborhood associations and business and other organizations around the redevelopment and the further development of the Prudential Center, which happened over a 20-year period. And the direct connection to the corridor, though, is that group dictated where the community benefits money from the various phases of that redevelopment were going to go. And one of the designated entities that received money, community benefits money, was the Southwest Corridor. And I wouldn't be surprised if your mini grants are still an offshoot of, I think the initial mini grants were a result of that PMAC money. And that was something that, I'll take some credit for making sure happened going on. And so, yeah, no, and for me, I continue to be moved to Springfield almost just about 9 years ago to be closer to grandchildren and for a better work environment for my husband, and but have stayed very involved with neighborhood association, our neighborhood association, and transportation related projects here in Springfield.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And thanks to all of you. I'm so impressed both by what you all contributed to, quote unquote, back in the day, but also your continued commitment to the community of Boston across a range of issues, a range of areas of the city even. And, we all benefit from the work of others. And I just want to thank each of you for all that you have contributed. And I find it very inspiring as we continue to work through PMAC and other organizations. All of us probably who are in this meeting are involved in civic engagement in one way or another. And it's important that we touch base occasionally and just affirm one another and see that, sometimes things take a long time, but they're worth, continuing and persisting. And I think each of you have illustrated that for us this evening. So I just want to thank you so much. And now I look forward, go ahead, Betsy, it looks like you want to say
I just
something.
want to make sure that we stay on and let others here
Oh, we are staying on.
Okay,
We are
give
staying on.
reminiscence and ask questions if they want.
Yes, very
As-
much so.
As
I was just-
mentioned, as much share your own. I just know from all the numbers of names of people I know on this call, who are here, there are others who have some other memories of involvement as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
no, I just wanted to
I
thank
would like
each
to-
of you, but I want to open it up to everyone to either put questions in the chat or unmute if you have a question and
Yeah.
just share it. But it sounds like Ernest has something he wants to share.
Yeah, I just like to do a shout out to the Southwest Corridor Farm. You know, that was an idea that grew out of Mel King, and it was a transition from Boston Urban Gardeners. And I'd like to shout out to Boston Urban Gardeners, Charlotte Kahn and Judy Wagner, you know, who put a lot of time and effort and energy. Leroy started, Bob Thornton, Byron Russian. There were a lot of people involved in this struggle, and it was ongoing. And without those organizations and the energy, you know, Ed Cooper, the Cooper,
Yep.
you know, Highland Park 500, you know, I mean, the list goes on. There were a lot of people, and you know, the guy I sort of missed the most was John Blackwell. I really enjoyed, you know, talking with him. You know, he was both from Harvard and MIT, and I think he was a minister to boot.
Well, and that's why
Anyway, yeah, I just want
the connection, the connection from Forest Hill Station down into the Arboretum is actually named after John Blackwell. That's
Yes.
So that does show, yeah, no, and I was thinking, you know, you did finally give a shout out to Ed Cooper, who really is the grandfather of Boston's community garden, other than the Fenway. He's the grandfather for community gardens in Boston. And I got involved in it because Charlotte Kahn used to live lived next door to me. So, you know, and
oh, so you didn't miss any meetings then, did you?
I lived between Charlotte Kahn and Ann Hirschfang. Did I have any choice?
None.
So I'd love to invite anyone who's attending to unmute and ask a question or share a comment or a memory.
Tracy, I have this on my mind, so I just want to pipe in now. I moved in '81, and my house backs up to Wheezy's, and they hadn't taken the highway down yet, and she's absolutely right about fires. It was actually during no fault insurance, and really, the neighborhood JP was kind of a lower class. I only say that. I mean, the families I got to know everybody. I got to know the kids. Actually, kids took some things from me while I was working on my house. And this one kid told me, go talk to their mothers. And I got to meet all the mothers in the neighborhood, and I never had anything stolen again. And it was, so it wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it was tough. And every weekend there would be a car would burn at the end of the street. And I'd ask the parents, I'd ask the kids, and they'll say, oh, that was some kids from West Roxbury stole a car. But then I'd see the actual parents in my neighborhood taking parts out of the car before they burned it. And then I learned that it was because of no fault insurance that people were scamming insurance companies and having cars stolen. And it was the same thing with houses burning. The houses were so cheap that it was cheaper. People got more out of the house if they burned it down. And so JP was burning, and it was just, it was all, and it's as Ernest was saying, it was kind of this collusion between the police, the insurance companies. It was just a bad time. It was a rough time in the city. There were more murders then. I drove cab, and I didn't drive cab until they put the glass screen behind the driver, because cab drivers were getting murdered. And I was just like, it was a really rough time. And one of the lights in my I was working every day, and the highway was, they're tearing it down, going up. One of the bright lights for me was Richard Heath, who had a newsletter on Franklin Park, and he lived on Forest Hill Street right across the street. And he wrote a newsletter about all the good things that could happen to Franklin Park. And it was his efforts that led to all those stones. When they took down the embankments of the Southwest Corridor, they put them along all the roads, Circuit Ave, all the roads in Franklin Park, where cars had been driven out there and set on fire, and people were working on their cars in the park and the golf course. Everything was just the whole. And so he inspired me that if you have a newsletter, or if you get the community involved, things can happen. And so when the land became available next to me for $3,000 left over from the park, I couldn't afford it. I couldn't afford it. It was like 3,000 square feet of land. But what I did was I went to Representative McDonough, and he helped me find another person to help, and we started a community garden there. It's now the Oakdale Community Garden. And so as bad as the times were, there was a lot of good stuff going on. People that could inspire you to get out and get involved. And I'm a kid of I was in college in the 60s, and the Vietnam War, I fought that. And, and all those people were in JP. They all moved to JP. So there was a lot of good stuff, a lot of good vibe, and people could grow off of that. So that's just
Thank
a little
you.
bit more my impression of that.
I will say,
Thank you
the
so much, Fred.
Symphony Road Garden is actually the result of one of these arson fires in the Fenway. And unfortunately, a kid was killed in that fire.
Oh.
And it's still, there's a memorial to that in the Symphony Road Garden. Yeah, and that's David Scondras came to, that was his, he organized around just getting stop the fires that were happening. Same thing in the South End. I mean, just block after block was empty.
I'm glad you mentioned David Scondras, because I had done, I frequently will kind of dive into archive newspapers, but I found a great article by him and another co-writer of kind of like a small is beautiful philosophy, where he cited the Southwest Corridor Park, which was not yet built, as like the perfect opportunity for edible gardening, for volunteers taking care of volunteers and stipended workforce development, taking care of parkland, and for, like basically community gardening as a food source, as well as community gardening as a community effort, which kind of reminds me, and I'd love to hear from you guys about community gardening. We sort of take it for granted that it's an important part of our city, but it was kind of a new idea at that time. And that's a question, not a statement. You're smiling.
Well, community gardens in the United States, actually the Boston Common is one of the very first community gardens in the United States. And actually among Europeans, indigenous folks, their method of gardening was community gardening. There were the Victory Gardens. There were the Depression area and the Victory Gardens of World War II. Most of those gardens actually became fallow or went out of existence after, when there was the push for returning veterans to go and have their homes with their own backyards and stuff. But it was in Boston, as elsewhere, because it was the American Community Gardening Association was started by Boston urban gardeners and San Francisco urban gardeners, and it's their counterparts in Chicago and New York, because there had been so much disinvestment in these core cities, and as well as the Great Migration. So there were a huge number of folks who had a farming background who couldn't get the kinds of food they were used to. They couldn't get, supermarkets didn't sell collards. And so that's really what in the 70s, was the push behind the starting of the community gardens, the resurgence of community gardening and the development, and a big effort. Mayor White gets a lot of credit for seeing that there was federal money through housing and urban development, where they could set up what they called the grassroots program, which in a much diminished level still exists in Boston, but basically it was the source of funds to create at least a rudimentary water system and fencing and the infamous railroad ties around garden plots in close to about over 30 gardens throughout Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, South End, all over this, those in Dorchester, those were the main neighborhoods where the Vic, I'm trying to remember what he called them.
Revival Gardens?
What?
Revival Gardens?
Yes, yeah, the revival that, and so Mayor White Kevin White gets a lot of credit for really helping gardens get going in Boston again. Well, greatly expanding.
Mm-hmm.
And then overall, although the city was never willing to take over helping to put money into the gardens and really run the gardens, other than through this, getting capital funds through this grassroots program, like other cities have done. On the other hand, they didn't, they let nonprofits become the owners of these gardens for a pittance, and not have the fights, not do like what Giuliani did in New York City, where he just, destroyed gardens that had been. So there's, at least been general support for the community gardens throughout, from Mayor White on in Boston.
Betsy, I have a question. This is Marlene.
Yes, howdy.
Nice to see you. Hi. I remember
Yes.
many PMAC meetings 25 years ago. They were dreadful. Things are so much better on the corridor. And thanks in large part, I think, to Franco Campanello, who is just fabulous.
Yes.
Thanks, Franco. My
Yes.
question to you, Betsy, is very specific. How much money did PMAC distribute? Do you know? I mean, separately to the corridor, but in total, how much money was involved for community benefits?
A lot.
But
I
Millions?
I don't remember offhand, no. But I do just remember the meeting that went to 2 a.m. in the morning of the negotiations among all the different representatives to PMAC, all lobbying for their own projects to make sure that they got at least some amount of funding. I think both the corridor and the Southwest the corridor and the South End Lower Roxbury Open Space Land Trust, I think over the course of all of the 6 stages of development got a total of $100,000 each. Although, and that distribution of that money took place over like a 15-year, was obtained by those organizations over a 10, 15-year project, as each, first the big tower was, first the concourse was built, and then the tower was built, and then the housing was built. And it's only been in the last 2 years that the final office building on Huntington Avenue has been built. So, and that effort started in 1988.
So are you saying that there was like only $100,000 distributed to the South End? Or
No,
the corridor?
that's how much was distributed to the corridor, I'm really feeling Frank. What's Frank's last name?
Campanello.
Yes.
Betsy,
Yeah, and that's all that was distributed. There was much more to the South End in terms of other projects.
I see. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Betsy,
Yes.
first I want to thank you because the money that you secured for the Conservancy began the restoration of the park. The park would not be anywhere near what it is today without your assistance from the very beginning. So thank you. Thank you. You've given me kind of a lifelong project that will take me another 20 years. My
Yeah,
accountants tell me I've got to,
I conveniently skipped town.
yeah, but it was, we got 50 grand. If there's more money coming, that would be really nice, but we only
No,
got,
I think there was money before, prior to that 50.
okay.
It's all gone. It's all,
Yeah,
as far as I
it's
know,
all-
it's all distributed. It was all distributed
Yeah,
10
with
years
that-
ago.
With the money that you got for us, we, Karen Holer was responsible for insisting on fencing. And the fencing basically preserved the space and the soil and the trees. And that started the restoration of the whole park. So congratulations to you. I always salute you because you're the linchpin or the beginning, I forget the word but thank you because
Well, my children never minded my going to all the PMAC meeting because I always came back home with wonderful cookies.
Chocolate chip, no doubt.
You know, Boston Properties didn't skimp on us and with the refreshments.
I have a question, and I'm not sure who I'm addressing it to. So really, any three of you, but anyone else who's here who has a sense of this. I think all of you mentioned public transportation and the moving of the train line, the Orange Line. And I think it was you, Ernest, who talked about blight and the perceptions of why would we move blight from one place to another. And, now I think in many ways, public transit is seen as such a desirable thing and, not without challenges, but it's just interesting to think about perceptions of the transit at that time, but also do any of you want to talk about really what it meant to move the Orange Line from where it was on Washington, which, and some of the connections through different parts of neighborhoods, and then by relocating it to where it currently is, it brought some benefits, but also some hardships for others. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'll jump on this real quick and leave some space. So it was on Washington Street, and it was called the L, right? And we don't have a Northampton Street station anymore, but from Dudley to downtown to Boston Street was a lot of it was elevated. So to move it to the other side, well, the idea was that train tracks have always depressed property. For the most part, the closer you are to the train tracks, the less value your property. So removing the L would increase the value of those properties on Washington Street. That was the idea. And then there was some pushback that the properties on this side, on the other side, where the track was going in, was going to go down, except they were going to be depressed and we're going to have parks and there's gardens. It's going to be really a nice thing. So on that level, transportation was good. But to this day, the Silver Line is still a bus, that never did. It hasn't really reached that point. And we still don't have anything going down Columbus Ave, which was also, part of the whole transportation scheme, which is still incomplete.
It is still the silver line.
Yeah,
and
it's still a bus too, right?
Oh yeah, no, it's still, and the initial plans is that there was going to be some kind of light rail to replace the Orange Line on Washington Street. And that whole, the replacement service to this day, I think is still something that divides Roxbury and the South End. The folks in Roxbury wanted one thing, folks in the South, that section of the South End wanted another thing. And there was never consensus. And so the result was nothing was done. And so that's why you just have, you know, a pretend, what do they call it? Track bus,
Yeah, Silver Line, yeah.
Silver Line. Yeah.
Other questions, other thoughts?
I just have to mention, Wheezy and I go back to, she was a union welder, and I was working for the American Lung Association doing occupational health advocacy. And we worked together with a whole bunch of other people to get our state to pass a right to know law to make sure that when chemicals are sold, you have to be told what those chemicals are in it or for the work, at least definitely in the workplace. So, you know, but 40 years ago, about that. Yeah, my son's 40 was 45 2 days ago. So yeah, about that.
Yep.
I love that story. I know if we could stay up, we could stay here until 2 in the morning, and I know that stories would keep pouring out because there's just such a rich group here, all of you really, and particularly our 3 panelists. But oh, Wheezy,
Tracy,
go
can
ahead,
I just
Wheezy.
ask a question to the gardening landscaping crowd? When the corridor was built, a lot of the public plantings were things like the blueberry bushes or the raspberry bushes or the spearmint or something. It was sort of unbelievably wonderful to have those things as part, not just decorative, but things we could eat. And they're still there. Was that a thing at that time? Is that something that creative gardeners understood to do, was to put that stuff into the mix?
Yes, very definitely.
Yeah, that was a movement that Ed was big on. And it was like edible landscapes. And that was one of the things that, you know, if it was an edible landscape, you know, Ed would okay it, you know, but if it was just a flower and, you know, it would just look good, it wasn't too particular about it. So if roses had thorns to, you know, stop people from going into the garden in areas where they shouldn't be, raspberries would be a better substitute, you know, for doing that. You could have the raspberry plant doing the same job that the rose thorns would do, and you would have the raspberries also. So
and people weren't, somehow we weren't as hung up with poisoning kids or, you know, right now, I mean, try doing some of these things in school gardens and you'll get total pushback. But no, I remember, yeah, Ed Cooper and Leroy Stoddard, they were the champions of that.
Easy. Can I just interject something? This is Franco. For lunch today, I had raspberries, and for dinner today, I had raspberries from the Southwest Corridor, Jamaica, in the South End. They're quite good. And the mint is superb.
The mint is wonderful.
And even the purslane is quite good in salads and very nutritious. So we eat regularly off the park still.
That's good.
Yep. And of course, Ernest is familiar with the children's garden that we're doing in Jackson Square, which is this year increasing the number of berries, strawberries, blackberries, raspberries. Tracy, thank you. Your raspberries are doing well. Mint, which is always there, borage, which if you don't grow it, you should, and peas, peppers, etc. Anything you can eat straight from the garden.
Well, yet another reason to thank you guys who were the original founders of this kind of planting.
Yes, yes. Thanks to Leroy Stoddard and Mike Talbot, to mention a few, and Susan Redlick.
Yep.
Susan Childs and Stu August. Yes, John Ellerson also.
It's a great way to wrap up, just thinking about, you know, eating from an urban edible landscape versus a massive highway project dividing our community.
Wow.
So
thank you for that.
I'm just so grateful to everyone here, both who helped bring us what we have now, and the many of us who are working together to continue the work and sustain and grow the park and make sure that it's available for hopefully generations to come, and for all the various uses that will evolve. The skateboard park, who knew that people needed a skateboard park, but they do, and it's about to open. So, you know, we have to keep evolving with the times. And
Well, actually, the dog park in the South End was not originally a dog park. It was a junior basketball court with a low basketball. Well, you can low basketball hoop, so younger kids could play basketball. Well, you can imagine how quickly that got destroyed, because bigger kids will not go and try to hang off something that they can go and jump on. So that court didn't last very long, and that's when people pretty soon saw that it was starting to be used by the dogs. People said, oh, well, it can't really be used for basketball. Why don't we start using it as a place to bring the dogs?
I look at it almost every day.
Yeah.
so much history, and also so much more to be, you know, tomorrow something else will happen on the park. Things are happening on the park right now. And, you know, it's a great resource for all of us. And I'm just so glad we've been able to come together and hear from these founding folks who really worked with many hundreds or thousands of others to bring the park into being.
Is the Wake Up the Earth Festival still happening?
Oh,
Other
yeah.
than last
Forgot about
year?
Slug and Femke. Yeah, Wake Up the Earth. That grew out of the Southwest Corridor Farm, and that's become a tradition all by itself.
Yes. Most recently, Betsy, in 2019, I think there were over 20,000 people there.
Yeah.
People come from all over the city, from outside of the city. It's kind of like Old Home Week, like people who've moved out of the city come back. You see people you haven't seen in a while. It's wonderful. We didn't have it last year, but or this year actually. So I presume that next year it will be happening. I hope so.
And first night, it was some of the same people worked on first night. The first night, you know, it was mostly all farmers.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to have to do this again because there's so much more to share. But I just want to wrap up and thank everyone for being here. And thank you, Weezy, Ernest, and Betsy so much.
Thank
This
you.
has been so
Thank
rich.
you. Thank you, guys. It was a lot of fun.
I welcome everyone to unmute and just thank our panelists or put something in the chat just to close our time together.